The courtroom buzzed with tension. It wasn't just another trial. This one had gripped the entire town. Cameras had been banned inside, but that hadn't stopped reporters from filling every available seat outside the courthouse. Inside, the mood was heavy, charged with a strange mix of dread and hope. At the center of it all sat a child, just 3 years old, named Emma Grace. She looked much smaller than her age, with pale cheeks, tangled blonde hair, and wide, uncertain eyes. She sat next to her foster mother, silent, her arms wrapped around a frayed, dirty teddy bear. Her shoes dangled above the floor, and she hadn't spoken since the day she'd been rescued. Emma's story was one the courtroom struggled to bear. A high-profile domestic abuse and endangerment case had left the community stunned when police discovered Emma locked in a closet of a rundown suburban home. She had been there for at least 2 days, dehydrated, starving, and barely conscious. The call that led officers there had come from a concerned neighbor who heard glass breaking and a child screaming. It had been a nightmare, but when the officers entered the house, they hadn't found Emma right away. The rooms were wrecked, drawers pulled out, glass shattered, blood on the kitchen counter. Her father, already a suspect in a past assault case, had tried to convince police there was no one else inside. It wasn't until a police dog, Coda, was brought in that the truth emerged. Now, weeks later, the trial had reached its final stages, and Emma was here, not to speak. No one thought she could, but to witness. Her testimony, or rather her presence, had been carefully arranged by the prosecution. She hadn't said a single word since being found, and many believed she was too traumatized to speak at all. As the prosecutor stood to make a final motion, she glanced toward Emma. "Your Honor," she said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce one final individual. He is not human, but he played a vital role in the recovery and safety of this child." There were a few murmurs. The defense attorney raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. The judge, a gruff man known for being no-nonsense, nodded once. "Proceed." Courtroom doors opened. The sound of claws gently clicking on the floor echoed louder than anyone expected. A large, poised German shepherd walked in, wearing no badge, no vest, just calm confidence. His handler, Officer Daniels, walked beside him with slow reverence. The moment the dog entered, a wave of stillness swept over the room. Emma's head turned. She blinked. Her foster mother leaned down and whispered something, likely reassuring her. But Emma had already let go of her teddy bear. Her small feet touched the floor. She stood up. Gasps were audible. One juror covered her mouth. Emma walked forward. The room had gone completely still. No one breathed. No one dared. And then, with the smallest hand, she pointed. Her finger trembled slightly as it extended toward the German shepherd. People assumed it was coincidence, a child's random gesture. Maybe she liked dogs. Maybe she thought he looked familiar. But then came the words. 2 of them. Soft, clear, heartbreaking. Double quotes him safe. Officer Daniels froze. The judge's pen slipped from his fingers. The defense attorney sat down without a word. Emma didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Those 2 words changed everything. The dog stood still, his gaze fixed on Emma, as if he'd been waiting for her to find her voice again. And she had, not for the courtroom, not for the adults or the jury or the media outside, but for him. The courtroom had just witnessed something no one could prepare for. A traumatized child, silent for weeks, speaking 2 words that shattered every legal doubt, every defense strategy, and every emotional wall. Coda had done his job once before, in a dark closet. Now he had done it again, in front of a room full of people seeking the truth. And truth, it turned out, only needed 2 words. The courtroom remained still as Emma lowered her arm. her small hand trembling slightly after pointing at the dog. Koda didn't move. He stood tall beside Officer Daniels, stoic and calm like a seasoned soldier back on duty. Though retired from active service, his presence carried the same gravity it once had during his years tracking fugitives, sniffing out explosives, and most memorably saving a little girl named Emma. Officer Daniels knelt beside him, giving the leash a slight tug, signaling that they should remain where they were. The judge cleared his throat, but even his usual authority seemed diminished in the wake of Emma's words. The defense attorney shuffled some papers, but didn't speak. There was nothing to say. 2 simple words from a toddler had cut through the courtroom like a blade. Him safe. No lawyer could object to that. No cross-examination could twist it. It wasn't coached. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw. It was real. The prosecution, sensing the shift, stepped back up. "Your Honor," she began, "the court has already heard the testimony of Officer Daniels and seen the forensic evidence. But I'd like to formally enter Koda into the record as a recognized responder in the rescue of the minor victim." The judge nodded slowly. "Proceed." Officer Daniels rose, clearing his throat. Koda is a 9-year-old German Shepherd. He served 6 years on the force before his retirement last fall. He was specially trained for search and rescue, narcotics detection, and child protection. During the raid on March 3rd, it was Koda who located the child, hidden inside a locked crawl space in the rear of the property. He paused, visibly emotional. When we entered the house, it was chaos. Broken glass, blood on the counter, and no sign of a child. The suspect kept insisting he was alone. But Koda didn't believe him. He broke from my side and ran straight to the back of the house. He barked at a wall, then clawed at a section of drywall. That's when we heard crying, faint, almost impossible to hear through the insulation. Some jurors leaned forward, their faces pale. Koda wouldn't leave the spot. We broke open the panel and found her, Emma, curled up in a ball, covered in bruises, barely breathing. She was hiding behind a bucket and a pile of blankets. Officer Daniels looked down at Koda. She wouldn't let anyone touch her. Except him. He lay down beside her and just stayed. Didn't bark. Didn't move. Just laid there until the medics came. She gripped his fur the whole way to the ambulance. A woman in the back of the courtroom began to quietly cry. Even the judge, hardened by decades on the bench, blinked twice and wiped his glasses with a handkerchief. Emma remained by her foster mother's side now, sitting again. But she kept one hand stretched out behind her, resting gently on Koda's back. Her fingers barely reached him, but that contact seemed to settle her. The courtroom watched silently, and for a brief moment, no one was thinking about sentencing, or verdicts, or case strategy. They were watching a little girl cling to the only living being she truly trusted. The prosecutor handed the judge a printed photo, a still frame from the body cam footage. It showed Koda lying next to Emma in the crawl space, his head resting gently across her legs while she cried into his fur. The judge looked at it for a long moment before passing it to the jury. "I think," the judge said slowly, "that we've heard from the most important witness we're going to hear today." And just like that, the room knew. Something irreversible had happened. The case, once locked in legal complexity, had been unlocked by innocence. Not by force, not by strategy, but by a bond between a wounded child and a brave dog. And the trial, though still underway, would never be the same again. The room remained silent after Emma's words, the kind of silence that seemed to echo. Her tiny voice, soft and fragile, had cracked through layers of tension and legal formality, cutting straight to the core of everyone present. Him safe. 2 simple words. Words that held more weight than hours of testimony. The prosecutor stood motionless. She had worked hundreds of cases, But none had ever taken a turn like this. Her plan had been cautious: show the dog, remind the jury of the Chol, rescue, hope for an emotional response. But she never expected Emma to speak. Not today. Not like that. The defense attorney looked stunned. His notes lay untouched. He opened his mouth to object, but quickly shut it. There was no objection that wouldn't make him look like the villain. In the room, a grown man standing up to dismiss the words of a traumatized 3-year-old girl and the dog that saved her. There was no way to spin it. Officer Daniels stepped aside and let Coda take center stage. The dog sat, calm and quiet, his eyes fixed on Emma. She was no longer afraid. That was obvious. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't curled into herself like before. She was still and alert, like she'd found her anchor again. Your Honor, the prosecutor said carefully, we would like the court to recognize the victim's verbal identification of the animal as a symbol of safety. We do not claim these words are evidence in the traditional sense, but we ask the court and the jury to weigh them for what they truly are. The judge adjusted his glasses, eyes settling on Emma. The court has discretion, he said softly, and sometimes it must rely on its humanity more than its training. He turned to the jury. You will consider the full context of these events, not just the words spoken, but how they were spoken, and what they meant. On the jury bench, one woman wiped away a tear. The prosecutor continued. Emma hasn't spoken since her rescue. Her therapists, her foster family, even medical professionals, all have confirmed she's remained nonverbal due to trauma. But today, she spoke. Not because we asked her to, but because of him. She gestured to Coda, and that changes everything. The judge nodded. Proceed. The next hour unfolded with carefully guided witness testimony. The psychologist who'd worked with Emma took the stand. Traumatized children often dissociate, she explained. They retreat into silence because words feel dangerous. But safety, true, emotional safety, can unlock that silence. What you witnessed here today is what we call a spontaneous verbal breakthrough. And in Emma's case, it was triggered not by a human, but by that dog. The jury listened carefully. The psychologist wasn't emotional. She was factual, professional. And that made her words all the more powerful. Emma associates Coda with survival. She wasn't just pointing at a dog, she was pointing at her protector. And by saying him safe, she was identifying the only creature who made her feel that way. Emma sat quietly again, her head resting against her foster mother's shoulder. But she hadn't let go of Coda. Her fingers, though tiny, remained gripped gently in the thick fur near his ear. For the remainder of the day, the defense offered no rebuttal. They couldn't. No cross-examination could undo what everyone had seen and felt. When the court adjourned, no one moved right away. Even the spectators in the gallery sat stunned, unsure of what to do with what they just witnessed. The judge rose and left. The jury followed. The attorneys packed up slowly, somberly. Officer Daniels gently led Coda toward the exit, but as they passed Emma's bench, the girl reached out again. Coda stopped. Emma didn't say another word. She didn't have to. She just looked into his eyes and smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled since being rescued. And for everyone watching, it was clear. The child's voice hadn't just returned it. Had spoken a truth louder than any gavel ever could. As the courtroom reconvened the following morning, a quiet sense of reverence lingered in the air. Something sacred had happened the day before. People entered more slowly. Jurors looked focused. But their eyes were different, now softer, more emotionally alert. The child's words and the dog's calm had broken through their defenses. Now, it was time to revisit how it all began. The prosecution's next move wasn't about legal strategy. It was about memory. Your Honor, she began, we request. Permission to play police body cam footage from the night of the rescue. We believe it will give context to the events that led us here. The judge nodded, his expression serious. Proceed. The lights in the courtroom dimmed. A projector flickered to life, and the screen showed a timestamp. March 3rd, 2:13 a.m. The footage began with Officer Daniels walking up to the suspect's home, accompanied by two other officers and Coda. Rain lashed down. The porch light was broken. As Daniels knocked, the door creaked open. Inside, chaos. Broken furniture, shattered dishes. A hole punched through a kitchen cabinet. A man, later confirmed to be Emma's father, stood shirtless, intoxicated, and belligerent. He shouted that no one else was inside, that he was alone, that this was all a misunderstanding. But Coda wasn't listening. The body cam caught him pulling against the leash, sniffing the air with urgency. He darted toward a hallway, claws skidding on the hardwood floor. Daniels followed. Coda, what do you got? Daniels asked in the recording, his voice tight. The dog barked twice sharp, insistent. Then came scratching. At the end of the hallway was a narrow door, disguised as a utility cabinet. Coda growled, pawing at it frantically. Daniels yanked it open. The footage jolted. Inside was darkness. Then the beam of a flashlight revealed a small crawl space behind insulation and boxes. In the corner, beneath a collapsed towel rack, was Emma. She was barely moving. Her eyes fluttered, and her body was curled into a tight ball. She flinched at the light. Her lips were cracked. Her arms showed deep bruises. And though she tried to push herself backward, she had nowhere left to hide. The courtroom was silent. On screen, Coda gently stepped inside the crawl space without being told. He laid down beside Emma, pressing his body against hers, his nose nudging her shoulder. She blinked but didn't recoil. Instead, slowly, hesitantly, she touched his fur, and then she stopped crying. Back in the courtroom, someone sobbed quietly in the back row. The video ended. The lights came on. The judge leaned forward, his hands folded. "Thank you," he said, voice low. Let the record reflect the footage was submitted without objection. The prosecutor turned to the jury. You've seen the facts. You've seen her condition. And you've seen the only moment of peace she experienced that night, and who gave it to her. Emma wasn't present in the courtroom that day. Her foster mother had kept her home, sensing she needed rest. But the image of her lying beside Coda, fingers clutching his fur, had burned into every heart in the room. Officer Daniels was called next. He walked to the stand, eyes shining but steady. I've seen a lot in my years, he began. But that night, it changed something in me. He cleared his throat. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't let the paramedics near. But when Coda got beside her, it was like something inside her decided to live. The court reporter paused for a moment, overwhelmed. She was disappearing, you know, Daniels added, right in front of us. But then he gave her warmth. He gave her presence. He gave her belief, the prosecutor nodded. And from that day forward, she never left his side? Daniels nodded. Not if she could help it. Coda's not just a dog to her. He's the first soul who ever made her feel safe. And with that, the truth deepened not just in evidence, but in hearts. The defense attorney stood slowly, like a man about to walk into a storm without an umbrella. The past few days had turned the trial upside down. What began as a case resting on technicalities and weak testimony had become a moral reckoning. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the jury, and approached the bench. Your Honor, he said, voice calm but hesitant. The defense wishes to remind the court that while the events shown were emotional, this is a trial of law, not sentiment. The witness is a minor barely 3 years old, and her words, while stirring, are unreliable from a legal standpoint. A quiet wave of unease rolled through the room. He continued, "Her identification of the dog as safe does not meet the threshold for evidence. She's a child under extreme emotional influence." "And objection," the prosecutor interjected sharply. The child's statement was not introduced as legal identification, but as spontaneous utterance, recognized under emotional breakthrough in trauma cases. The judge held up his hand. "I will allow the jury to consider the full context." "Continue, counselor, but tread carefully." The defense attorney nodded, then turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this child has been through something no child should ever endure. But we must ask, are we allowing our hearts to override our judgment? There's no forensic evidence tying my client to the injuries. No direct eyewitness. And a 3-year-old without cross-examination is not enough to convict." He sat down. The silence afterward was louder than his entire statement. The prosecutor stood calmly, her posture confident. "Let me introduce our next expert." She called Dr. Allison Harmon, a licensed child trauma psychologist. Dr. Harmon was composed, middle-aged, and spoke with a steady cadence that immediately drew attention. She took the stand, looked at the jury, and began. "Emma exhibits classic symptoms of complex PTSD: silence, withdrawal, non-responsiveness to human contact. But there's a unique behavior seen in many child victims' nonverbal bonding to a source of perceived safety. In this case, CODA." She pulled up a chart showing behavioral responses in traumatized children. When words fail, the brain still seeks anchors. This dog didn't just rescue her physically. He created her first experience of safety. When she said him safe, it wasn't about liking dogs. It was a declaration. This one didn't hurt me. This one protected me. And that contrast tells us who did the opposite. The defense remained quiet. There was nothing to challenge. Dr. Harmon continued. "What makes this more profound is that Emma spoke those words on her own, without coaxing, in a high-pressure setting, one of the most intimidating environments a child can face. The courtroom. That alone supports the validity of her response." The prosecutor stepped forward. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, were those 2 words, him safe, reliable as expressions of trauma and memory?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "They may be the most honest thing we've heard all trial." Then came the final blow. The prosecutor turned to the screen and played a short clip from the hospital after Emma's rescue. The video showed Emma asleep in a hospital bed, her hand tightly clutching CODA's badge, which had been temporarily hung around his neck. Nurses moved quietly around her, but she didn't flinch. The monitors beeped steadily. CODA lay on the floor next to her, head resting on his paws, eyes always on her. Gasps echoed softly across the courtroom. The defense attorney closed his briefcase. He knew what everyone else now accepted. The case was no longer in his hands. It was in Emma's. Emma had spoken. She had broken through her silence, not because someone begged her to, but because someone earned it. A dog. A hero. Her voice had returned. And so, the defense crumbled not in fury, but in quiet surrender. Courtroom emptied for the day, but no one truly left behind what they just witnessed. Outside, reporters scrambled for statements. Inside, the atmosphere felt like a sanctuary. Officers lingered in the hallways. Jurors sat longer than usual before leaving, as though their bodies remained anchored to the courtroom by the weight of the truth they now carried. Emma sat quietly in the hallway, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, her legs dangling from the wooden bench. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her eyes weren't wide with fear. She was still, calm, as if something in her spirit had begun to repair. CODA sat loyally at her feet. UNOVING. Officer Daniels approached them slowly. In his hand, he held something small but powerful, CODA's badge. It was a smooth metal tag, engraved with the words Service K9, Unit 912. KODA. He knelt beside Emma, offering the badge with both hands, like a medal of honor. He wanted you to have this, Daniel said softly. Emma looked up at him, then at Coda, then slowly reached out and took the badge. Her small fingers curled around it, as if it were treasure. And then, for the second time that week, she smiled. Daniel smiled back, blinking hard to hold back emotion. A local reporter quietly snapped a photo at that exact moment. A police officer, a child survivor, and a faithful dog, frozen in a single moment of healing. The photo would go viral within hours, but in that quiet corridor, it was just a simple moment of peace. Later that evening, the police department released a statement. Today, retired K9 Officer Coda was formally honored, not for a bust, not for a chase, but for saving a life in the most human way possible. His badge, now worn by the child he rescued, will forever represent protection, loyalty, and healing. Letters began pouring in. Toys and blankets were sent to the precinct from all over the country. Schools sent cards. One kindergarten class from Colorado sent hand-drawn pictures of Emma and Coda standing on clouds. The community was no longer just watching a court case. They were watching a child rebuild. Back in her temporary home, Emma kept Coda's badge next to her bed. She asked to sleep with it under her pillow. Her foster mother gently agreed. Coda now lived with them full-time, officially placed in her custody. Though retired, he had a new job now, guardian of a little girl learning to trust again. Emma's foster mother, Miss Thompson, sat with her one night and asked, "Why do you like Coda so much?" Emma, brushing the dog's fur slowly, whispered, "He stayed when I was scared." It was the first full sentence she'd spoken since the rescue. By the next court session, word of Emma's breakthrough had reached every corner of the county. Journalists weren't just asking about the trial. They were asking about Coda, about the bond, about whether the justice system could be changed by the love of a dog and the trust of a child. Inside the courtroom, the judge made an announcement. Before proceedings began, this court acknowledges the unique contribution of retired K9 Coda in the safety and recovery of the minor victim. As a symbolic gesture, and with unanimous support from court staff, local law enforcement, and the Kojo District Attorney's Office, we hereby retire Badge 912 permanently and recognize it as belonging to Emma Grace. The entire courtroom stood in a spontaneous ovation. Even the defense attorney, now resigned to the inevitable, applauded softly. Officer Daniels placed a hand on Emma's shoulder as she clutched the badge in her palm, unaware that history had just been made. For the first time in the courtroom's long legacy, the hero wasn't just a lawyer or a judge. It was a dog, and a little girl who, against all odds, had found her voice again. The courtroom was packed on the day the jury returned. Word had spread far beyond the county, across the state, and even nationally. What started as a painful abuse case had transformed into something deeply human. Reporters filled the hallway. Police officers, off duty, stood along the back wall, not for protection, but to witness what felt like justice finally reaching its destination. Emma arrived early, holding Coda's leash in one hand and his badge in the other. She wore a soft yellow dress and tiny brown boots. Her foster mother walked quietly beside her. There was no fear in the child's eyes now, just stillness. A quiet kind of strength. Koda, calm as ever, sat beside her as the court clerk called for order. "All rise," the voice echoed. The judge entered. The jury filed in. 12 men and women, most of them visibly affected by the emotional journey they'd taken over the last few days. Several stole glances at Emma, and some at Coda. Their faces didn't reveal the verdict yet, but the weight of their decision clung to the air like a fog. The judge cleared his throat. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? The lead juror, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and tear-streaked cheeks, stood. She held a paper in her trembling hands. We have, Your Honor. The bailiff took the slip and handed it to the judge. He read silently for a moment, then looked up. On the charge of felony child endangerment, he said, voice even but intense. How do you find the defendant? Guilty. The courtroom didn't breathe. On. The charge of felony abuse, causing severe emotional and physical harm. Guilty. A sound broke in the gallery, a muffled sob, then applause, quickly stifled by the bailiff's warning look. The judge continued reading. On the charge of obstruction of justice. Guilty. And finally, on the charge of attempted intimidation of law enforcement. Guilty. All counts. The defendant Emma's father sat, stone-faced, his arms crossed, unmoved. But the courtroom had no sympathy left for him. His lies had cracked, and his cruelty had been exposed not by experts or forensic evidence alone, but by the unbreakable bond between a child and her protector. The judge turned to the jury. Thank you for your service. Then to the officers. Remand the defendant to custody immediately. Sentencing will follow. 2 deputies approached. The man didn't resist. There was nothing left to fight. As he was escorted past the gallery, his eyes briefly met Emma's. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. She simply held on tighter to Coda's leash. Officer Daniels, standing near the bench, bent down and whispered, You did it, Emma. She looked up and nodded once. The prosecutor stood beside her and placed a small, official-looking folder into her hands. Inside was a certificate signed by the judge. Honorary badge. Holder Emma Grace. The judge stepped down from the bench, a rare move, and walked directly toward her. Emma, he said softly, kneeling so they were eye level. You didn't. Just help us find the truth. You reminded us why the truth matters. He reached out and touched Coda's head. And you, he said to the dog, saved more than one life. A ripple of applause broke out, and this time, no one stopped it. Reporters would later describe the scene as one of the most emotional moments in courtroom history. Officer Daniels scooped Emma into his arms, and Coda followed them out, his tail gently wagging. As they reached the doors, Emma looked back once not at the man on trial, but at the judge's bench. Then she whispered to Daniels, Can we go home now? He smiled. Yeah, kiddo, you're safe. For the first time in her young life, those words weren't a hope, they were a promise. A year had passed since the trial ended, but the story of Emma and Coda still echoed across the country. News outlets occasionally rearing clips of that unforgettable courtroom moment. Schools taught it as an example of courage and healing. And outside the courthouse, where justice was served, something new stood in the center of the plaza. A bronze statue of a little girl and a German shepherd, frozen in an eternal moment of trust. Etched into the base were 2 words that had once silenced a courtroom. Him safe. The unveiling drew a crowd. Officers, survivors, therapists, families, they all came. The mayor gave a short speech. This statue, he said, is not just a tribute to an extraordinary K9 and a brave child. It is a reminder that silence can be broken, that healing is real, and that sometimes heroes don't speak at all. They just stay. Emma, now 4, stood beside Officer Daniels and her adoptive mother, Ms. Thompson. She wore a denim jacket with Coda's real badge sewn into the sleeve. It had been retired forever and belonged to her now. Around her feet, the real Coda lay quietly, older now, but still watchful. After the ceremony, Emma approached the statue. She stared at it for a long moment. Her fingers traced the metal version of Coda's ear, then the girl's hand on his back. It was her. the memory captured in bronze. But she wasn't frozen anymore. She was growing. Thriving. Emma now talked to almost everyone. She laughed. She colored her world with stories and drawings. But one thing remained the same. Koda never left her side. At home, he slept beside her bed. At therapy, he waited patiently outside the office. And when she was scared, she only had to whisper his name. One morning at her new school, Emma's teacher asked the class to share what made them feel strong. Kids raised hands with answers like my mom, or Superman, or pizza. Emma raised her hand too. My dog, she said. The teacher smiled. Because he protects you? Emma shook her head. Because when I couldn't talk, he listened. The room went quiet, the same way the courtroom had gone quiet months before. Koda wasn't just a pet. He was living proof that presence could heal where words failed. That sometimes just staying is more powerful than saving. At the police department, Koda had become something of a legend. A mural was painted in the K9 wing, half of it a fierce action scene from his earlier career, the other half showing him lying peacefully next to a sleeping child. Officers told rookies his story like it was a rite of passage. Officer Daniels had since taken on a new role, training future K9 units. But he also became Emma's godfather. He visited often, bringing toys and old service gear. Each time, Emma greeted him the same way. She'd run up, hug Koda first, and then laugh. Hi, Uncle Danny. Life had moved forward. The scars Emma carried would never fully disappear, but they had become something else now. Reminders not of what she suffered, but what she survived. At night, before bed, she sometimes held the old badge and whispered her two favorite words just once, like a lullaby. Him safe. And Koda, now with a graying muzzle and tired legs, would curl beside her, still listening. Still watching, still protecting, because some bonds don't break with time. Some heroes don't need capes, and some stories are never really over.